Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to be modeling this whale shark. Now, I did a video recently on doing articulated 3D printed whale shark, and we started with this model where I had already created the shape. I have gotten a couple comments and emails asking to go over how you would create a shape like this. Now, on this channel, most of the stuff we do is car or motorcycle type related. We haven't really got into sort of modeling these more organic shapes. But I figured we'll go ahead and do a video. We'll talk about it. The process is fairly straightforward, but there are some very tricky areas. The mouth, for example, is a very tricky area that we're going to have to work on. We can kind of see the way that the edge flow is working here, and we're going to have to spend a lot of time on that. But let's go ahead and talk about the overall process, how we start the design, how we start to add a little bit more detail, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a little bit more confidence to try to model stuff like this on your own. So first things first, we need to start a new design. So we're going to start a new freeform model, and the basis of any new freeform model comes down to your choice of the primitive or the starting shape. In some cases, we might go for a sphere, like if I'm going to be modeling a pumpkin or an apple, for example. I'll start with a sphere because the point at the top where everything comes together is not really a big deal. It's going to be covered up by a stem or something like that. But generally, when we have a model like this where we've got a convergence of all these edges to a single point, that's something that we want to avoid unless the model really calls for it. For something like a helmet, which we've done before, a quad ball is a great option. When we're talking about car modeling, we generally start with either a face or a plane. But for the case of the whale shark, we're going to start with a cylinder. So we're going to begin by sketching on the front plane and just figure out about how big you want to make this thing. I'm going to start with about 60 millimeters. I'm going to change the height faces down to 1. And I'm going to leave the diameter faces at 8 for now. We're going to say OK. And from the front, I'm going to select everything. And I want to begin by scaling it outward. So a whale shark is pretty wide and low. So we're going to stretch it out roughly 1.6 scale. And then we're going to say OK. So this is the basis, the starting point for us. Now, this design originally, it's intended to be 3D printed. So I needed to make sure that it had a flat base. The best way to do that is to delete the number of faces you want to get rid of and then just fill it back in with something. This can be a bridge. We can use the face tool and snap to those vertices. Bridge in our case is going to be straightforward. I just need to make sure the number of faces leaves me with one line in the middle so I can use symmetry. And also I'm going to select keep creases, which is going to crease those edges for me, keeping that bottom flat. Now we can add symmetry. Just pick one side and then the other. Make sure that we do have a green line at the top and the bottom. So this is the basic shape. We're pretty much done at this point. So let's just go ahead and add a little bit more detail. I'm going to start by selecting this back edge. I'm going to go to Modify. I'm going to hold down Alt and drag it all the way back wherever I think I need the tail. So if you let go of Alt and press it again, it's going to add another edge for us, and that's okay. The next thing that we need to do is move our pivot point. So we're going to use the Move Pivot Point option, move it down to the bottom, and then we want to scale this down. So it's going to taper toward the back. Then we're going to double click on this edge. Again, reset that pivot point. It needs to be at the bottom center. Actually, it doesn't have to be in the center. If we're only scaling vertically, it just needs to be on the bottom. If we are scaling horizontally, you want to make sure it's in the center so that way both sides scale inward equally. And then we'll scale this down as well. We basically just want a transition of the body. If you want it to be a little bit wider, you can always just play around with the scale horizontally and vertically. So take a look at the side view. If you want it to be a little bit taller, you can pull that up, but I think that looks pretty good. Now with a whale shark, actually the head sort of goes out and then comes back in. So if we take a look at this from, let's say, a top view, you can see at this section here, which is kind of where we started, it goes out and then tapers in, and at the eyes it tapers in a bit more, or at least that's how I modeled it. So what we're going to do is start here, and we are going to reset our pivot point from the jump. So we're just going to put it down there. And from a top view, hold down Alt, pull this out. I'm going to scale it horizontally here. and up a little bit vertically. Remember the pivot point's at the bottom, so we can do that. And then again, hold down Alt, begin to pull it forward. Alt one more time. And this time we're going to start to narrow the head here. And I need to scale it down. So you will need to just play. If you've got a reference image, that certainly helps. But for right now, I think this works pretty well. And then this is roughly where the eyes would be. So again, Alt, and we'll taper this in a bit more here. And taper that down. And we're going to worry about the mouth later. So that's the basic body. The next thing that we need to do at this stage is think about where we want to add details. So this is going to be roughly the corner of the mouth. This position, before I add any more detail at this sort of low polygon stage, I want to make any generic changes to the shape before I get too deep into subdividing and adding those level of details. So if you want to, say, make a placeholder for the mouth, this is a great time to do it while we're only really dealing with 3 edges on the front. Once we start to add more edges, it becomes much more complex. Same thing on the back. If we want the back to sort of taper, this is much easier to do in box display, so Alt and 1 on the keyboard. If we want this to taper, we can play around with these edges and just get a good transition here. Alt and 3 to go back to our smooth display. So once we're happy with that, now we need to start adding a bit more in terms of subdivisions. It looks like maybe I need to grab this. So the main reason that we need to subdivide really comes down to the fact that if we try to make a fin on the top here, we just don't have the number of edges to make it happen. Before we subdivide, we should really take a look at the overall model and think about where some of these subdivisions need to be. So for example, I'm going to start by going to Insert Edge. I want to make sure that I'm using the exact insertion mode. And in this case, I'm going to make that positive 0.5, which is going to insert an edge here. Using the exact insertion mode will keep the shape exactly the same. I'm going to do Control Z and undo so we can see the difference here. If I go to Insert Edge and I do a simple insertion mode, the shape is changing. And this is because in the box display, that edge that was inserted, the 2 lines on either side of it are still perfectly straight. So if I do Control Z to undo, and we add in an inserted edge using the exact mode, what you're going to find is the angle between these edges, it's very minor depending on where we're inserting this, but it's not straight. And that's the key difference here, is it's going to use the exact insertion mode to maintain our smooth shape, where simple insertion mode will just slap it exactly in the middle and cut up any edges that it goes over. So anytime we want to preserve the basic shape, make sure that we do use exact mode. The next thing that we need to think about is we are going to have an extra edge when we start to add fins on the top. So I'm going to double click this edge and I'm going to use Insert, Exact, but single is fine because we have symmetry. You could also use the both option, but single because we do have symmetry, that's going to be fine. So this extra set of edges here is going to be important because once we start pulling those fins up, we don't want them to be too sharp. It'll be too hard for us to 3D print. But now we can go to our subdivide option, box select everything, exact insertion mode, and start to think about where we need those divisions. We don't need a lot in the width faces, but we might need quite a bit in the length faces. Keep in mind that a lot of those are going to get added to the front, which could be problematic. If that's a problem, instead of selecting everything, we can just box select the areas that we need to add, and we can leave a sort of low number of polygons where we don't need it. So I'm going to say OK and allow it to just subdivide that back section. Now, this isn't the way that I did the original model. I subdivided the whole thing. But as you begin working with these forms, especially if you're trying to create organic shapes like a whale shark or some sort of animal, then the fewer divisions you have, the better off you are. And unfortunately, once we subdivide, if I come in and I start to try to delete these edges, while that's perfectly fine, the shape is not preserved anymore. So just removing those edges is possible, but it doesn't preserve our shape. So now let's go to a side view and let's start to add our fins. Where we add the fins is going to be important, and how we add them is important. So for this front fin here, I'm going to make sure I'm selecting the green line. I'm going to shift select. I'm actually going to take both of these and pull that up and back. So as I do this, I want to scale them inward to make it a bit tighter. And that's basically it. Now, if you find that this point is too sharp for you to 3D print, then essentially what you need is these edges need to come higher up the model, and it'll make it thicker, but you will also need to scale them inward as well. So the best way to do that is to take them with you initially, or to use the soft modification option. So if we take them with us and pull them up, you can see that it stays wider. If we just take that center section here and we turn on soft modification, we get an idea of how far that influence is going to go. In this case, it's using a circular reference. We may want to use rectangular, which allows us to dictate the face count. So in this case, I'm going to go maybe 1 face in the length and maybe 2 in the width. And so what this means is as I pull this up, it's going to also bring some of those other references with it, and it'll keep it a bit wider. You can also play around with, let's say, Control Z. You can also play around with just taking one edge, especially if you're using soft modification, and pull that up and scale it down and just kind of get a feel for how it's changing the model. So I think that looks pretty good. We also need to do the same thing back here. We do need to be careful with how close we are to the back. So instead of taking an edge, I'm going to take that vertex there, and you can see that it's pulling here. So I'm going to have to go a bit further forward. Maybe this one here. Make sure it is the top one. They're kind of close together back here. And as I pull that up, looks okay. If it's too wide, again, you can also turn off soft modification and pull it up, and it'll stay a bit more narrow. But just, again, keep in mind that the actual width of that, if you go to 3D print it, it might be a bit narrow to print. If you view this in box display, it'll give you a better idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that one vertex there on the side, and I'm going to manually pull it up and then take a look at this in smooth display. So what that allows me to do is just make it a bit thicker or wider there. For a 3D printed model, that's fine. There is also another little one in the middle here, somewhere maybe around right here. Just pull that up. It's pretty minimal, but something like that. All right, so that's the 3 fins on the top. Now we need to worry about the fins on the side. The way that I would approach this is by extruding. So from the top, what I'm going to do here is take those 2 faces, hold down Alt, and pull them back, and scale them to narrow them. And then I also want to take these faces in a bit, scale them down a little bit. After we make those, we do need to come back and use Modify and Crease. Because our crease now stops where we extruded, we need to carry the crease along the bottom edge. Again, because the intent with the original model was to 3D print it, I want to try to maintain a flat plane with a crease at the bottom. Not only does that simplify the process of us designing it, because we kind of have a good idea as to where it is on a build plate or a plane, but it also does help us with adhesion. So having a bigger surface area here and not having a smooth bottom where we need a bunch of support or raft or something. So that does help there. The other thing is there is another set that's probably somewhere about right there. And again, top view, hold down Alt and sort of pull that back. Same thing, we want to scale it down. Maybe take these, just pull them inward a little bit. And go to crease. So it looks a little bit crazy here. Once we crease, it should clean that up, hopefully. Yeah, that looks better. Looks like there's a crease on the top, so I'm going to uncrease that top. I may have accidentally had it selected. That looks okay. So that's the basic body. The last two things, or three things that we need to do. One is the eyes, which all we're going to do is a quad ball, or we could do a sphere as a B rep after we finish the form. Both are going to be fine. But we need to finish off the mouth, and we need to finish off the back, and then we can add a bit more detail. Now, when I say a bit more detail, the original model we 3D printed, I had some sort of creased sections or some raised sections to just give it a little bit more, I don't know, uniqueness. So we're going to play around with adding that, but let's go ahead and finish off the shape first. A couple of ways that we can do this is we can try to just use modify and fill hole and see what it looks like. I've found that this actually ends up being pretty nasty, especially if you use collapse. But you can use a reduced star option, and then we can crease these bottom edges. And in most cases, that'll give us a fairly decent result. If you have to do it manually, what you're going to end up doing is just playing around with the model. I'm going to go ahead and just add that. What you're going to end up doing is playing around with the model quite a bit and just manually building some of those faces. Remember that we can use T-points. We can also carry some of this geometry around. So for example, if we want to take this all the way to the midline, that'll help us push the shape out. And box display will help us kind of see what's going on here. So in reality, we would probably want to pull these out a bit. So I'm going to go to a side view, maybe pull that back a little bit, and also scale them vertically to try to get them more in a straight line. And then let's take a look at this in smooth display. So not perfect. I don't really like that bump in the middle, but probably not worth a ton of effort. I may want to get rid of this edge, just delete it and leave it like that. I think that looks okay. We can also get rid of some of these edges. So for example, just selecting and deleting edges. That looks like it's okay. Now, the next part here, the mouth, is probably the trickiest part of this whole thing. There are a couple ways to do it, but we're up against a problem because we have creases on the bottom here, and those creases are going to have an impact or an effect. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to double click this. I'm going to go to modify. And from the front view, I'm going to hold down Alt and scale it inward. Now when I scale it inward, let's rotate this around. I scale it inward. This is going to be the starting point of the mouth. It's going to be probably the easiest way to do it. But these creases they really shouldn't be there. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to uncrease and get rid of that. And then we're going to go to crease and make sure that we're creased across there. Now, probably not the best thing, but again, if we're trying to maintain a sort of a clean edge where we're going to be 3D printing, that's going to be the way to do it. So double click this edge. This time I'm going to go to a side view and I'm going to do Alt and pull it backward. But before I deselect or do anything else, from a front view, I'm going to scale it down and then I'm going to scale it vertically. So we're starting to build out that sort of mouth shape. I'm going to say OK. And at this stage with that selected, I'm going to fill hole. I'm going to try to do a fill star and say OK. Now fill star is not the final solution here, but what this allows us to do is manually come back and figure out where we want these edges to go. So I definitely need to connect in the middle. And I probably want to connect this one to this one. And that should give me a clean shape. So it looks pretty good. And now that we've got something here, we can play around with it a bit more. So for example, we can pull this back. Let's go ahead and take both of these back. Pull that back a bit and just give it a bit of a deeper shape. We don't want to get too crazy with detail here simply because it's going to be trickier to print. But I think just kind of narrowing that down, maybe taking this edge here and pulling it back, that'll give us a sort of a good general shape. And you can play around adding as much or as little detail as you want. So for example, if we take this edge and we say insert edge on the, let's go negative, and we'll do a simple insertion mode. That'll tighten up that transition a bit. So Control and 4. So it gives it, a bit of a tighter transition. Really, this is where most of the time is going to be spent. Adding details like the mouth, we can do that relatively quickly. And for a 3D print, you're not really going to notice much. But if you want to really spend a lot of time on a realistic model, probably not the best software for it, honestly, if you're trying to do realistic sort of animal models, but you could really kill a lot of time doing that. So that's the overall basic shape. Now it's time for us to add a couple of extra details. And when I say extra details, what I mean is sort of those stylized lines where we've got harder edges on the side of a model. And the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to start here and Control double click this edge on the back. It's going to allow me to select that entire edge. And then I'm going to go and use my bevel tool. Now, bevel is a tool that we've used quite a bit on car models, especially when we're trying to add stylized lines. I'm going to use 0.1 for the bevel location in one segment and say OK. And that instantly will give us that harder transition without doing much extra work. And then it slowly fades away into the front. Now, if you want to carry it all the way to the mouth, all you really need to do is just select the entire edge. One thing that you do need to be careful with here is if we're using one edge insertion, then we want to come back and weld one of these vertices back together. Having that transition where we've got 2 T-point or 3 T-points in a very narrow area is not going to be good. If you want to transition that more forward manually, we can always use insert point, and I can carry it forward to, let's say, pretty close to here. And that'll help me carry that shape forward. And you can see that it goes right into the corner of the mouth there. And we're going to end up, we would put the eyes right above it. Yeah, that's one way that we can add those details. Let's go ahead and add a few more. This time I'm going to do it to maybe here. And let's do Control double click. We're going to go to bevel, but this time we're going to insert 2 segments. And the reason for that is when we insert 2 segments, it'll leave the center one there. So these will still be connected, but the ones on either side will now be added at those distances. And all we need to do in this case is Control double click and manually move or modify its position. So from this, I'm just going to pull it up and out slightly. And probably want to be careful with this back one, maybe manually pull that one back in and Control and 4 to hide the edges. So again, what we're doing is we're just kind of adding some stylized lines. This one is likely going to be where the eyes are. So what we can do here, let's go ahead and go to a right view. What we can do here is gradually transition that away a bit more. So from here, I maybe want to go a bit wider and delete that edge and repeat the process up top. So maybe go from here a bit wider, delete that extra edge. And so what we're doing here is we're taking that harder crease and we're transitioning it away so it's not so harsh. So now we've got this sort of section where we can put the eye. We've got a little bit of a stylized line above it and one below it. We could carry that into the mouth as well if we wanted to. Remember that when we're dealing with these shapes, if we try to transition and change direction, we're going to end up with a star point. And the star points generally, they're going to cause problems. The last thing I'm going to try to do is I want to add a little bit of ridge on the top of the head. This is not something that we had on the other model, but a little bit of a ridge here. So I'm going to, again, use the bevel, 2 segments, so it puts one on either side. And then I'm going to take this vertex, that vertex, and this one, and we'll just pull those up. So pull them up just a little bit. And while they're selected, Control and 4 to hide my edges. So again, just adding a little bit, it kind of disappears at the front. It disappears by the time we get to the fin. We could carry it onto the fin if we wanted to, but it just adds, again, just an extra little bit. Now, if you wanted to carry that all the way through, we can certainly do that. We can add more edges, but for right now, I think you hopefully get the idea or the point in the way that we did this. So once again, for the eyes, we can add them now as freeform models, or we can just do them as a BREP primitive sphere. The reason that you would want to do them now is really comes down to whether or not you want to deform it. So if I do a quad ball here, and it's inside, so I can't really see it, but I can scale it if I need to. So let's take this. That's way too big. And let's move it into position. We're going to scale it with the center option, scale it way down, and sort of stick it there. We'll go to a top view, figure out where that needs to go. So again, the reason that you would do this as a quad ball or something in the primitive space is if you wanted to stretch it out a bit more and basically figure out a non-spherical shape for this eye. So let's go to a top view. Sorry. I know the zooming in and zooming out sucks, but it's kind of how we have to work. So there, if we wanted it to be a little bit more ovalized like that, if you want to bug it out a bit more, you can. And then all we need to do is we'll go to symmetry and we'll do mirror duplicate. And then we'll pick our mirror plane, which in this case will be that. It's only going to treat it like a single solid body, but then when we finish the form, we should have 3 solid bodies and we can just combine them all together. So the main body, and then just add those eyes to it. So that's it. This is, the reason I didn't do this originally is because even though it's not a ton of work, it is still enough work that it's tricky to follow along with. Playing around with forms, especially for organic shapes, can take quite a bit of time, but it's for pretty much any shape. And we're going to do a couple more of these videos where we talk about creating complex shapes with forms. But basically what you want to do is you want to think about the base shape, the starting shape, in this case, the cylinder, and working with a low polygon or a low face count model for as long as possible to get the basic shape. And then we subdivide it with the exact option and got to the point where we could start to add those extra details. Just like the other one that we did here, you could then go through and add all the extra freeform features and cut the model up, and then add the print in place articulating features, and basically the same thing. Obviously, there are some differences in these two models because I didn't exactly copy this. I just kind of followed the same workflow. But you can see that this one, we did have that sort of stylized edge here. There was another 2 stylized edges on either side of those fins. So I didn't do that in the one we just did. And I left the head shape pretty smooth on that one. Whereas this one, we've got that sort of ridge feature on the center, and we didn't carry that extra edges around. But certainly something that you can continue to play around with. And hopefully this gives you a little bit more confidence on trying to make your own shapes. Just make sure that you do take the time and never worry about undoing your work or scrapping it and starting over. That is a big part of it, especially with freeform modeling. No matter how much experience you have, you're going to run into problems and you're going to have to work around them. Sometimes the workaround is starting over. Sometimes you can delete edges and add new edges and get around it. But following the basic process, figuring out the starting shape, and then working slowly with a low number of faces before you start to add more detail, that's going to be universal across the board. Now, if you have any questions on this, or if you want to see more of this kind of video, modeling things with forms, then please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.